Good afternoon to everyone. First of all, sorry for being late. Organizing this event is quite complicated, and we did our best. First of all, Ka Utrecht from Jacobin is not gonna be here, so I'm gonna act as the moderator of the event. We have Oliver Eagleton here, editor from the Daily Review from the Sidecar blog. We have Elisa Greco, Naomi Gordon-Loeb from Jewish Currents, Elisa Greco of ROAPE, Review of African Politics and Economy, and Mireia Vell from ONCE. So it's our Catalan representative here. We are trying to reflect about how, as media outlets, we can fight the narratives of the far right, and how the editorial process and the publication processes has changed with this authoritarian turn, this militaristic turn of capitalism. We want to understand from them, so I'm gonna let them to speak in the first introduction, how they are handling their editorial processes. For example, I'm sure that all of you are taking a lot of decisions. For example, in Jewish Currents, they started to talk about genocide. They started to introduce a lot of methodologies for getting audio notes from Gaza. This is like practical decisions that we, as publishers, are starting to take. We want to collectivize this knowledge, and we also want to think if it makes sense to start thinking on wider collaborations across media outlets. And given that the far right is using tons of money from think tanks, they are building fake accounts, they are putting a lot of money into social media, they are financing all these kind of media outlets like the one of Javier Negre. You all know this fascist, the Spanish fascist, being involved in the politics of Argentina and so on. Now we want to talk with the leftist editors and try, we bring them here to Barcelona from all over the world, and we just want to share this knowledge with you. So if you want, Oliver, can you start thinking expressing to us how your work has changed since when, for example, when you saw that we are seeing a turn into how capitalism operates, and when you understood that we are in danger, and when you started to think on which editorial decision and how to change the processes on your own, and then we can continue with the interventions if you find it's okay. Okay?
Sure, thank you. Well, I might maybe just answer the question in a bit of a roundabout way, because when you invited me onto the panel and I saw that the title was about reactionary narratives, I was sort of masochistic enough to go and actually read a lot of, the publications of the new right, just to see whether I actually had a handle on, the narratives that we're trying to counter. And there are some features of these publications that are actually quite surprising when you really flick through the pages of somewhere like American Affairs or Unheard or the Claremont Review of Books, places that transcend just basic kind of right-wing clickbait and try to actually articulate some sort of coherent world outlook. And I guess what I found was that there are sort of three dominant fictions that these outlets kind of trade in. The first one you might call a certain kind of realism, like the opposition to the left on the part of these publications is often not really an opposition to many of the political positions or policy ideas that are associated with the left. There's often kind of quite an open-mindedness about things like public ownership or even wealth taxes or reindustrialization or whatever. It's an opposition really to what they see as the left's naivety or idealism. They think that the left's vision of an emancipated society is simply impossible, and that there are certain material problems that are insoluble. And they particularly think that the working class is not, the agent that's going to fix any of those problems, and that idea is a romantic and a nostalgic throwback. So the right presents itself in contrast to this idealism of the left as the force of realism, acknowledging that the only meaningful political forces in the present are, the right and the center. And that's a powerful and appealing narrative to a lot of people, because when you look at the political landscape today, it is often the case that the only forces, with the ability to affect change are the right and the center. And so, first fiction, realism. Second fiction, I think there's a kind of false universalism that the right peddles. They see the working class, as I said, not as an agent of emancipation, but as an agent of reaction, because it has a certain set of kind of universal principles. It wants to protect its community, it wants to protect existing hierarchies, it wants to find a sense of belonging, and it sets up these sort of supposedly universal principles in opposition to the principles of liberalism, which supposedly undermine them, or in opposition to, outside threats like migrants or gender ideology. So that's universalism. And then the final fiction, I think, is freedom of expression. The right sees itself as defending freedom of expression as one of these universal principles. And it's an odd sort of claim, but when you read these publications, often, they are actually full of quite sort of stylish writing or like strong authorial voices, because they're trying to, spin this narrative that only the right will stand up for the right of the individual to express themselves. So I think, in contrast to a weakened left, which doesn't have a lot of institutions outside publishing that can sort of advance its narratives, the right, the world of the intellectual right and its publications can rely on a whole network of political parties, think tanks, and so on to really embed these fictions in people's consciousness. So I think one lesson, and now I'm circling all the way back to the question, is just that left-wing publications need to have enough sort of modesty about their ability to counter these narratives in isolation from broader political movements. If we want to counter these narratives, we have to be as embedded in political infrastructure, political parties and so on, as the right is embedded in, this whole reactionary ecosystem.
No, this is good. This is good. Cool. It's great to hear you talk, Oliver. I'm Naomi Gordon-Lobel. I'm the deputy publisher of Jewish Currents magazine based in the U.S. And it's funny. I guess we are each taking this prompt a little bit differently. Like you were thinking about the part of the title of the panel that's about reactionary narratives. I was thinking about the title of the panel, the part that says magazines serving movements. And I've been thinking, so as deputy publisher, a big part of my job is thinking about the strategy of the magazine as an organization. What role are we playing? Who are we? What is our identity out? And what is our relationship to our communities, to our readers, to movements? And there's something in the title of this panel that is actually a little bit inherently contradictory and embodies a tension, which is that our role as, what does it mean to be a magazine of the left? As journalists, our primary role is to tell the truth, to report, to expose things that people in power have tried to bury. Our primary role is not to necessarily be activists. We know that our work will bring about change and is an important element of bringing about change, because we know that hegemony functions largely based on burying the truth and obscuring realities of injustice and inequality. So we have an important role in bringing about change, but we're not necessarily, we go about it in a different way. And so there's an inherent tension there, and I think at Jewish Currents we really see that, because we are very close to, and many of us are in relation with, activist groups. Many of us, even on our own, might be part of them. I, for example, got arrested several times last year as parts of civil disobedience against the war in Gaza, against the genocide. It's totally separate from my own work at Jewish Currents. So sometimes we get some pushback from activist groups, from organizations that we are very close with, that we're comrades with, that are like, hey, how come you're not writing more about what we're doing? Or how come you're not covering this awesome action we did? Or how can you write so critically about our movements? And it's hard because on the one hand, we don't want to be a PR firm for an organization. We don't want to be writing press releases for the organizations that we're in community with. If we did that, we would lose our integrity and we would lose our specific power, which is to report, to provide rigorous analysis, investigative reporting, storytelling. And at the same time, what does it mean to be a magazine of the left, to be grounded in our politics, right? Like, I have no patience for armchair leftism. If we have a theory of change, if we know that change is necessary, then we also have to be thinking about how it happens. And it doesn't happen in a Google Doc. So there has to be some kind of a connection to, like, what role do we play? And so I think just like one example of a way that this tension has played out with us recently is Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an organization that I think people very closely associate us with, also a Jewish anti-Zionist project, but an activist one. We haven't written as much about them perhaps as they would have liked, but they had their national member meeting in May, and Ariel Angel, our editor-in-chief, went down there. And she wrote a dispatch from it, and it was reflective, and it was personal, it was individual, it was sober. It was like, this is what I saw at this gathering of this activist group, and this is what it told me about the state of our movements, and this is how I'm feeling and thinking, almost sort of as an avatar for what any of us might have thought if we were there. And I think that's a more honest way of engaging with that work than just sort of like firing off a press release about this group did this awesome action, right? So that's one thing. The other thing I thought that's sort of the tension of this panel. And then I also think there are opportunities, and there's a couple ways that I think about them. One of them is, how do we concretely, as a magazine, do our work in a way that protects our writers and our sources who are vulnerable? And sometimes for us, particularly since October 7th, that has meant making choices that are perhaps go against the most orthodox journalistic practices. So we allow writers to use pseudonyms because we understand that people who are writing under repression might face really severe consequences for their name being out there. We pay people in unconventional ways so that they can actually be paid for their work. We've taken people's writing down if we know that they are really the subject of state violence and that the writing that they have published with us might worsen that violence. Those are not things that most magazines do, generally, but we're not living in normal times. And also, we are a magazine of the left. So that's one thing, is just sort of thinking about how our practices as an organization, not just what we write, but how we write it and how we go about producing that work can support our values in politics. And the last thing I'll say is that a magazine, there's another inherent tension in leftist magazines, which is that a magazine is an inherently solitary practice or object, right? It's you alone with the magazine. It's one person reading something. It's like deeply just you and the page. It's so isolated. But actually, if our work is in service of movements, of community building, then we want to be bringing people together. And so we have, particularly in the last couple of years, really done a lot of work around events, around bringing folks together, like in this room, whether that's parties, whether that's panels. Last year we had a festival of more than 1,000 people called Jewish Currents Live, very similar to this event, bringing folks together from all over to talk about the issues facing the Jewish left. Francesca Albanese, who I think is going to be here too, was there. Online. Oh, okay, online. Yeah, fair enough. She's pretty busy. But we've found that those are a way that we can, take the magazine off the page and into a room and bring people together and be making connections. And I just want to tell one little story, and then I'll pass this off to you, about one of our events, which is that we had a launch party this summer for our most recent issue. And we decided to collaborate with a queer nightlife group called Queer Aperitivo, which is on the surface pretty different from us, right? They're like queer, young, hip. They're very left, but they really have nothing to do with the Jewish magazine. But we figured, why not bring our communities together? They throw super popular parties. They're always fundraisers. And so we did, and it was a huge success. And there was I heard from a bunch of people that they thought it was a block party because it had totally taken over the sidewalk in front of the bar. it was a fundraiser. We raised a bunch of money for mutual aid for Gaza, which is one thing that we can't necessarily do as a magazine, right? Like our subscriptions don't benefit mutual aid. But okay, we can throw a party and get a bunch of our subscribers in the room and redirect their resources towards actual, really significant, in this case, mutual aid. So that was great, and we also are reaching new audiences, right? Folks that might not have otherwise read us. But there was this moment at the end of the party that made me think about that, which is that we have this sort of like older guard of like older Jewish leftists, people my parents' age, and they're very loyal supporters. They come out to our events, and so this group of these, Jewish elders came out, and they were there right at the beginning, and they ate a bunch of food, and as they were getting up to leave, the founder of Queer Aperitivo came up to thank them, and she was like, "I'm so glad that you came." And they were kind of a contrast to most of the people in the room. It's like all these like young, queer, hip people, and then there's these like Jewish boomers who are like just there to eat and talk about their favorite magazine. And so there was a bit of a funny sight, like two groups of people that normally wouldn't have been in the room together. But the founder of Queer Aperitivo, my friend Aura, came up to them, and she was like, "Thank you so much for coming." And one of them, this gentleman, said to her, "I'm so glad I have you here, Queer Aperitivo. I always wanted to ask someone, why are there so many gay people in the Jewish anti-Zionist movement?" And I was there. We both laughed because it's a funny question. And then, Aura thought about it, and she was like, "Well, I think a lot of, white Jews who might have otherwise not really been politicized and as able to have an analysis around Zionism have been politicized around queerness, and also many of them came up during early years of the AIDS crisis, were organizing with ACT UP, and have brought those skills into anti-Zionist organizing." And he was like, "Wow, that's so interesting. I never thought about that. I wrote a paper to take homosexuality out of the DSM in the 70s, and it was great. It was this moment of connection." And so he walked away thinking about that. And do I think that moments like that are going to, they're not going to bring down Trump or fascism. But it's a way, ultimately, of strengthening the intersectionality of our movements, drawing connections, breaking down silos that are otherwise there, and maybe possibly using the magazine as a tool to bring people together, beyond just on the page.
Right. Wow. I'll just go straight in, and sorry if my voice is a bit low. That's the best I can do. One word you said, connections, has been key for the review of African political economy. I'm Elisa Greco. I'm one of the 4 editors, and we work as a collective, so we don't have a deputy or editor-in-chief. We are a group, and we're quite rowdy. So we actually share some of the same debates you mentioned. This collective was founded in 1974 by a group of academic activists in support of liberation struggles in Africa. So the dilemma of deciding on campaigns, deciding which campaign we support, which campaign we don't, is a constant one in our collective, and one that we're used to deal with, right? And I think I agree with you on a basic point that I think is forgotten, and what marks the difference between journals that do the journal thing, which is okay, write, publish, make people read, reflect, and journals that have an activist edge, like the Review of African Political Economy. We do bring people together. So in the last 10 years, we've been organizing connections workshops, they're called like that, in Ghana, Tanzania, South Africa. The Namibia one was stopped in its tracks by COVID. And these are festivals of ideas and festivals for exchange between activists and academics. And they've been a great inspiration on both sides and a great source of exchange. Most of the exchanges that we had and that keep on going, you can find on the website of roap.net. But also I think the second thing that we did, and that I wanted to discuss more here at Read with other journals, we took a very bold step last year. The collective started in 1974 by people like Ruth First, a South African journalist and intellectual who paid with her life for the support of the cause of the struggle against apartheid in South Africa. Of course, we're not at such heights now, but we do have social movements coming to us and ask to publish, sometimes anonymously, to, as you raised, protect writers when political oppression and political repression is way too dangerous. And I see in the public people who fully understand what it means to have a safe space, not in the liberal acception of the term, but a truly a safe space where some debates can be aired. And in the recent years, we could react rapidly thanks to the website, to social movements coming to us during protests. So in the early days of protests in Burkina, in Kenya, many different examples, because we just learn from our African colleagues and comrades about organizing and really not giving up. We learn about the practice of struggle. So ROAP has always been a huge learning space, and a space for disagreement, of course, because we host very heated debates on different interpretations of things. One of the latest ones you can check out for yourself is on, of course, the recent developments on extractivism in West Africa, the debate on military Marxism, and what it means to reread history by looking at victories. That I think it's particularly needed in this moment, in this particular moment. And when I was discussing the title of this panel with a Tanzanian comrade, it was like, well, fighting the far right, we've been doing that for as long as I can remember, so it's not new, we just need to be a bit bolder. So what we did at ROAP to be bold, we went against the grain. We are a peer-reviewed, double-blind academic journal. We've been publishing 4 issues per year since 1974, non-stop. Regarding, financial constraints, capacity constraints, people leaving, people coming, as any collective. Last year, we left our corporate publisher and we went fully open access. So you can access the journal free of charge, and this is a journal that hosts African young and less young intellectuals, so it's vital to grant free access outside of institutions. So, and we've seen a boom, a real boom of readers, looking at the stats of downloads of our journal, a boom of readers, and a lot of the contacts we get are actually from the youth, which is quite encouraging because we do host and reprint the classics from Cabral to Sankara, Samir Amin, who was one of our first comrades and contributors. So the big thinkers that we try to invite and reprint. And all these are acts of resistance. They're not new. We just make it stronger now because in neoliberal academia, the pressure to publish or perish at any cost, but also the trend of institutions and funders to promote a false version of open access, a pay-to-publish model where authors have to pay to be published open access by corporations. So we decided to go against this, leave our corporate publisher and go fully open access, which is something that in the Africanist academia is regarded as very risky because, of course, it's not a sector where there's a lot of money. So we're still standing very bold, and actually the readership has gone up. So as soon as possible, we will resume the Connections workshop, and I hope we can also listen more to African activists and authors who remind us that actually organization is key to effective and successful coming together of different struggles.
Like summarizing. So I'm Basque. She's Catalan. I'm going to translate in English from Catalonia, so please appreciate the effort.
Sorry, my English is not good enough to explain you what I want in English, so Thank you, Kate. 11 és una revista jove, una revista que neix vinculada al Centre d'Estudis d'Unitat Popular, vinculada a l'esquerra independentista, un moviment polític de l'esquerra radical independentista catalana nacionalista dels països catalans, i és una revista que parteix, en la línia del que plantejava la Naomi, d'una lògica en el que el coneixement està insertat al moviment, és a dir, amb la idea aquesta d'intel·lectual orgànic gramsciana, en el que nosaltres no aspirem a tenir intel·lectuals emancipats de les nostres organitzacions polítiques, sinó que volem que les nostres organitzacions polítiques generin coneixement per la transformació social.
This is describing that we are talking about 11, which is because of the 11 theses of Marx. This is just to understand. It's tied to a political organization, which is la CUP, which is nationalist and Catalan and leftist, radical leftist, most radical leftist party in Catalonia. And what Mireia was trying to say is that for them, knowledge is inserted in movements. So for them, this Gramscian approach to intellectual organics that are outside thinking in the vanguard, it's more tied to maybe the intellectual organic that is to a whole cool ambition. It's the one which is behind, is doing the hard work, the hard task, and because of that, he has all those tacit knowledge that they want to put it in a beautiful publication, I will say, and they try to reflect upon the current conjuncture.
Nosaltres entenem el pensament com una eina de construcció de moviment, és a dir, no entenem que sigui una cosa separada de la pràctica política. I precisament quan ho posem en diàleg amb l'extrema dreta i en com combatre les narratives de l'extrema dreta, entenem que el coneixement és fonamental perquè el coneixement esquerda, agrieta les narratives conservadores en la mesura que és una eina d'imaginació política. És a dir, l'extrema dreta, en un moment de frustració política, almenys al Mediterrani, s'alimenta de la por, de l'angoixa, de la imprevisibilitat de les societats, del desconeixement. Per tant, la capacitat intel·lectual i política d'imaginar altres formes d'organitzar-nos, de pensar, de funcionar, d'estimar-nos, fins i tot, és un torpedo a la línia de flotació de l'extrema dreta que precisament viu, és com un paràsit que viu de la frustració, de la por, de l'angoixa i de la impossibilitat de tenir imaginació política, de la impossibilitat de tenir esperança.
She's saying that thinking is key for building the movement. I mean, I think that what you're saying is quite crucial for the discussion. She's saying that knowledge is key, sorry, this is not the correct word, but to fuck up the narrative of the far right because it allows imagination. The capacity to imagine, the capacity to think on alternatives here works as revolutionary. She said like a torpedo against the fault lines of the far right because it goes against the basis of the project, which is us as postmodern consumers, which are alienated, which are frustrated, which we don't want to think on anything other than the market. So for them, trying to show that there are alternatives through imagination, it's their main political goal.
L'últim número que nosaltres publiquem, que és un número sobre l'Estat i el dispositiu polític institucional, fem una entrevista a Álvaro García Linera, que per nosaltres és un sociòleg de referència bolivià, i ell parla del temps liminal, que seria l'interregne gramscià, que seria el moment, aquest moment que les coses no s'acaben de definir, i deia Gramsci que sorgeixen els monstres, García Linera ho explica com que és un moment de disputa per la manera com s'administraran els recursos. Hi ha una disputa des dels anys 80. I llavors, clar, com en aquest moment de temps liminal o d'interregne és possible un Trump, és possible un Milei i alhora és possible una revolució democràtica al Mediterrani, no? Perquè és un moment de disputa. Llavors, com nosaltres, des dels moviments polítics però també des dels espais de pensament, contribuïm a generar pensament crític i contribuïm a capgirar aquest temps liminal i aquest interregne cap al socialisme democràtic. Jo crec que per nosaltres és una de les preguntes que mou permanentment quan pensem què publicar, qui fer entrevistes, de quina manera i quin paper ha de tenir el coneixement i la teoria crítica al socialisme, diguéssim, actual i el que mira cap al futur.
Mireia is talking that the last number of Once magazine is about the state and how we can instrumentalize it for a kind of democratic revolution, democratic socialism. She was taking the words of Álvaro García Linera, the former vice president of Bolivia. He needed to escape from home after a coup d'état. Yeah, yes, get the word in French. And he describes this idea of libidinal time, that moment where it starts to appear different ways to manage resources. They can either be on a way as Milei or Trump is envisioned, but at the same time, this interregnum, as Mireia was describing, this moment, it's also possible that a Milei or Trump arrive, but also that a revolution, a democratic and a socialist revolution in the Mediterranean can appear. So for them, critical thinking, it's key for this democratic socialism, and theory and action via journalism pages needs to be focused on this idea. Okay, my time again. I think that now we can stop talking about what do we be prepared for doing some questions if you want. But I would like to ask you maybe a couple of questions inside one. It's first, you were talking about organization. I think this term is key. It's the common key here. We were discussing with Carlos Prieto, who is the editor of New Left Review in Spanish, also the translator of most of Sidecar articles, and that Gaza, and if we are talking about reactionary narratives, there's nothing worse, there's nothing more terrible than Gaza. All of you are treating in your pages in some way or another. But it hasn't provoked in Europe, neither in North America, neither in the global south, a kind of revolutionary moment with people get Gaza, maybe in the universities and so on, but this is a question, to get organized as a vector against the system. If Gaza is something like the worst we can imagine, and people should be mobilized, and not people, political parties should be mobilized. Here in Spain we don't see this. I mean, neither Podemos, neither CUP, any movement has managed to politicize this thing and to build an organization around it. And do you think that media can help with this? Do you think that your magazines can be not just a means of communications, but a means of organization? How we can get that Marxist concept of the militant that is present on your talks to create another subjectivity inside the militants that can use the journalism work or the editorial work or another kind of work for creating and for envisioning not just a new world or imagine a new world, but media as also as a mean for creating new needs, new desires, new ways of understanding the desire of political belonging via media organization. Do you think that this is possible? Do you think that this is a crazy idea also related to this? Which is the role of digital technologies in this era, which are, I mean, you don't need to go to TikTok or Instagram. They are a mean of gratification. They are apparently they are appealing to us, and they have kind of a lot of political power. The far right is using social media. They have social media. Are designed for disseminating en masse all this political work from the far right. do we need also, apart from these new subjectivities, new organizations, can social media, can technologies, not the ones designed by Mark Zuckerberg and so on, but the ones designed by the left, by the militants, be this kind of infrastructure for organization? Do you think that this is needed? Do you think that this is technotopia? I don't know.
Can I go first on this one? Do you mind? Sorry about that. It's just because I see that sometimes, sorry I missed the debate this morning, I just wasn't well enough to join. But sometimes there's a Eurocentrism that I find a bit sad, because what we've learned as a review, and it's just a review, right? It's a journal, so we're not a party, we're not a movement, but we give the space, and first of all we listen instead of initiating the debate. We first listen and see what's going on. So what we see a lot among social movements and wide forums across many different African countries, so I'm wildly generalizing here, so forgive me, 41 countries. It's that movements use WhatsApp groups and Telegram groups, and they move to other medias which are better encrypted when it's too dangerous to use WhatsApps. They already do it, and each of us in the collective is in touch with, we specialize each of us on 1 or 2 countries, right? So if you listen to these debates, what's happening in the last week? Like in Tanzania, the movements are not talking about Trump. They kept talking about Gaza, of course, and they kept talking of Gaza in terms of colonialism, but they're looking at Nepal. And I learned much more from them than, reading Western outlets, because they're focusing on change and they're focusing on things that are happening and potential, and they're happening in potential and evolving right now. And I think there's a freshness in that that I do not find, and I think I'm speaking for the collective here, I'm not just speaking about my own individual. There's a freshness and there's a baseline where, of course, a lot of the struggles are on another level, on the level of basic survival, where just surviving as a movement and existing and still being up there fighting is enough. So it's a sign that there's potential for then broader organizing when the spark becomes fire. And I'm, of course, thinking about Egypt, but the examples are many. And Kenya is just the last one. Western Africa is putting once again in question the model of extractivism. There's a lot actually going on. We do not have a role. I think this is, the collective has been talking about this. Our role is not that of showing the way. Our role is that of providing the space and really make sure that that space is open, and that's why we went fully open access. We said no to the paywall, we said no to pay to publish. We want it to be an open, protected, safe space for debates, for disagreements, but most of all for listening to what the activists are telling us. And of course, we could, talk for hours about the role of the party and what we have lost. But it's that sort of spirit, that sort of endless reflection on the failures of the past that weighs us down. And that's, if you want to check it up on ROAP, the very controversial intervention on military Marxism by Adam Meyer, tells us this, like, why have we forgotten the victories and the strength that actually is in us, which is the strength of the majority?
I suppose I was just thinking when you were asking the question about political organization, that, effective organizing obviously often relies on having a target or having an enemy. Gaza has been, in one way, a deeply demoralizing situation because the enemy is the genocidal regime, which is very far away, and it's the White House, which is an impenetrable power block that seems like it can't be influenced by any form of political organizing. But, I guess to give just a couple of examples from Britain, there have been, very effective forms of organization that have identified kind of local targets, local actors who are implicated in what's going on in Gaza and who have affected, sort of meaningful change on that local scale. So we have this group, Palestine Action, that has been sabotaging Israeli weapons factories and has been so effective at doing that that Israel has, that the Israeli company Elbit has removed some of its operations from Britain and has written to ministers talking about how this is, disrupting the supply chain and so on. You also had a situation at the last election in Britain where 5 MPs were elected running against the entire political establishment, running to the left of the Labour Party on pro-Palestine platforms, and were able to draw a connection between the situations in their local areas and the situation in Gaza as, instances where the establishment is demonstrating its, disregard for human life, both like among its own constituents and among the people it's, committing genocide against abroad. So I guess when we're thinking about how these international sort of crimes, this international situation can be translated into effective forms of political organizing, maybe there is a role that publications can play in sort of, identifying who among the community of their readers is a sort of a legitimate target for political organizing, for political influence. And it's only if you understand the sort of international situation, it's only if you have a fully sort of global understanding of what's happening in Gaza that you can then act effectively on a local level.
I will speak to the social media thing. Yeah, that's what I was actually going to say. I've worked in media for more than 10 years, and so I remember when Facebook was like 50% of your traffic if you were a digital news site. RIP. And I think social, and I'm old enough to remember when Facebook started, and so I feel like we've all watched, right, as it's the role that it plays in organizing has changed. And I think what we've known for a long time, that the danger of relying on social media is that ultimately these are platforms that are controlled by corporations, and just as easily as they can open the faucet, they can turn it off too. And we see like such a stark example of that now. It's almost like we've come to this grotesque illustration of that with Elon Musk, where Twitter, which has been used, so all these tools have been used by activists in really powerful ways, but ultimately, for folks who, in addition to the many evils of Elon Musk and Twitter, which I can't really call X, one of the things that changed recently is that the algorithm has changed so that basically links to external sites have been, are far devalued in the algorithm, so that if you are sharing a link to an external site on Twitter, your content is that much less likely to be seen. The algorithm is shaped in a way that you won't be seen. Because why? Obviously, Twitter wants to keep people on Twitter because that's where they make their money, right? So if you're sending someone to an article somewhere else, no one's going to see it. So what that means is that by putting so much of our traffic, to use the technical term, right, but so much of our power to disseminate our stories into these platforms, we've then also given them the power to totally shut the door on our stories too. So I don't, and news sites are now, struggling with this. New York Mag had a story recently that said something about like the traffic apocalypse, which like, I think we have a lot of other apocalypses going on too. But I don't know what the solution is, but I do think that it's so clear that dependence on corporate platforms for sharing our work, which is ultimately the most powerful tool I think media can play in movements, right, is like providing the materials, the information, the stories that can be weaponized in service of our movements, that as long as we're reliant on these platforms, we're really, really vulnerable. And we're just kind of seeing that all implode right now.
No, escoltant-vos, no? A part de tot el que plantejaven elles, jo penso que hi ha dues altres coses. A l'estat espanyol el suport a Palestina és pràcticament unànim, no? Però hi està havent una deriva, una mena d'adhesió per emocionalitat, no? Està sent lacrimogen en molts aspectes, no? Mitjans de comunicació, imatges, violència repetida una vegada i una altra, no? Llavors, jo crec que la capacitat d'agafar aquesta emoció tan descarnada i transformar-la en una cosa política és important. I és un dels papers que ha de poder fer també l'esquerra marxista més intel·lectual, no? Polititzar el dolor i aquesta cosa tan emocionalment desfeta i incontrolable per canalitzar-lo en els termes que necessita el poble palestí.
One of the things, Maria, I wanted to say is that in the Spanish state there's a big support for Palestine, but there's also this media approach, like if you need to cry for what's going on, and they are all the time showing the violence and they are repeating it on the TV and all the pictures on the media. So for Mireia, trying to politicize the genocide in another way, trying to channel the emotions, trying to transform, trying to not to do politics with the pain, but trying to use the genocide also, the emotion around it to politicize the genocide and the war, no? As using like the correlation of forces that it's in the Spanish state.
I l'altra cosa és que crec que tenim una tasca també que és d'elevar o de tenir la capacitat de fer mirada d'ocell. El que hem de tenir la capacitat de fer mirada d'ocell, com estratègica o llunyana. A Palestina hi està havent un genocidi, però el que també hi està havent és un combat amb la idea del dret internacional. La Cort Penal Internacional emet una ordre de detenció contra Netanyahu i no passa res. Per tant, hi està havent també la fita, la visada de la possibilitat que hi hagi un dret internacional basat en els drets humans. I aquesta qüestió és profundament problemàtica, no perquè ens pensem que el dret sigui una cosa justa, perquè el marxisme fa molt temps que ha analitzat el dret en base a la correlació de forces, però sí perquè entenguem que estem creuant una porta que almenys a Europa era una porta que feia 40 anys que estava tancada, que era que hi havia una cosa que es deia dret, que hi havia unes lleis i que el dret internacional era sagrat. I Palestina està sent també el combat per això. És a dir, el genocidi del poble palestí és a més, obrir la porta a que no hi hagi, diguéssim, cap tipus de normativa en relació a la vulneració flagrant dels drets humans. I això també és un dels anàlisis que penso que hem de poder fer. Hem de poder explicar al món en aquest moment d'interregne què suposa el genocidi del poble palestí. Pel poble palestí i per la resta de pobles del món.
The second point, it's important to historize what's going on in Palestine. It's nothing new. It has been going on for years, so it's not how we do with these reactionary narratives. No, there's a huge political work in the previous years to be done, like what Rob is doing. It's a genocide and it's a battle, that it's not just an emotional battle at the level of the state. It's a battle at the level of the international penal court, and I did say it correctly, sorry, I'm a bit crazy now. Again, it's against Netanyahu, and nothing is going on. She's saying that this is, even that as Marxists, we understand that law is problematic, that I think, she thinks that it's the only moment that the law has been denied. It was against the Palestinians, and for her, it's important to point out to these contradictions inside the system, to build movement, to build a solidarity, not just that explains what's going on to the Palestinian people, but also to the rest of the world if we allow this genocide to continue. That was Mireia. We have still 10-12 minutes for the hour before we go to to the genocide table, even if this turned to be a prelude of it. So if any of you have some questions to the audience, I mean, I will be very pleased if you can do short questions and not big comments, and if it can be as generic so all of our comrades can get back to it. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'll be quick. I have two questions. The first one is regarding what Oliver was saying about the right, and I wanted to say if there's any ideas on how to make it clear that the left is also realistic, universal, and what was the other one? Of freedom of expression, if there's a way we can actually show that in this algorithm that makes us have to use a language that's quick and fast. And my other question is also regarding what Lisa said about Eurocentrism, and I wanted to ask if you don't feel that it's also reactionary, that in Europe we tend to think about Gaza as something that was outside and had nothing to do with colonialism that had started here. And since you mentioned apartheid, I think it's a good comparison of the way Europe is always doing in its narrative, a way of saying this happens outside Europe and not something that is the continuation of it. Yeah, if there's any ideas on that topic and how the global north has to change the narrative on that.
Do we want to get a few more questions so they can get them together? Anyone else want to? Nothing? Well, these are very good questions. So.
Well, yes, I mean, I suppose I should have said in my contribution that it's an amazing logical sort of contortion that the right is able to do in presenting itself in these terms, because, of course, if you just take the three categories, I mean, the right is addled by sort of paranoid and racist fantasies, and it presents them as a sort of reified form of reality. You know, the right is the most sort of particularist and the most identitarian political force, and yet it presents that as universalism. And of course, it's also deeply conformist and deeply boring, and yet it presents that in the guise of individual expression and, you know, yeah, the freedom to be oneself without the censorious left clamping down on your expression. So, you know, it's a sort of system of thought that that doesn't work on a sort of logical level, and that's why it relies on, as I said, these sort of broader infrastructures to make it cut through. I suppose the left, you know, the left doesn't have those infrastructures, and we've been talking about how we should build them and how we should sort of support them in whatever small way we can as publications. But I mean, thankfully, we don't have to perform the same kinds of, you know, somersaults intellectually or otherwise.
Those are really thoughtful questions. Thank you. I want to speak to the second one, even though I'll speak to it from the US, but I think there's a similar problem there, which is that, and I'm glad you gave me the opportunity to say this because I wanted to, which is that sort of relates to your question earlier also about like, why has this moment in Gaza not necessarily turned into like a sort of larger political, not sort of turned into necessarily this larger political analysis or moment beyond like our specific intellectual spaces, let's say, or beyond specific parts of our movements. And I think the thing is that in the US too, there's this, I think there are plenty of liberal Zionists who grew up in the US and have enough of an analysis to say, yes, what happened, the genocide of indigenous people in the Americas was wrong. And what happened here was colonialism, was genocide, was an evil beyond what we could ever use words to describe. And those same people are able to say, well, what's happening in Palestine is different. This is the Palestine exception, right? Largely because of this sort of the term anti-Semitism that gets thrown around, right? Well, like, that's different, you know? And of course, one of our roles specifically, I think about in my role at Jewish Currents and our role in general as Jewish anti-Zionists is to say, no, to be anti-Zionist doesn't mean to be anti-Semitic. And actually one can be anti-Zionist, to separate the conflation of Zionism and Judaism. So just thinking about this like, sort of separation of like, oh, you know, colonialism is something that happened here hundreds of years ago and there's nothing we can do about it now, but that's separate from what's happening over there in Palestine. And one of the things that I like to remind people or think about is that the early Zionists were very clear that what they were doing was a colonial project. They used that language. If you read Theodor Herzl, he was very clear, this is a colonial project. We are bringing civilization to this barbaric place, and we are colonizing them, and we will have to do it by force. And so the absolute denial of that and the erasure of that. Oh, sorry. Just, I think some of the similar mechanisms that you're describing there of kind of an exceptionalism and an ability to always say, well, what's happening, this terrible thing has nothing to do with what we're supporting now, is also at play in the US.
Naomi, I didn't want to cut you short. It's just that I'm building on what you said.
Yes.
The word that is missing, and this is part of the problem with Eurocentrism, is imperialism. And ROAP, the Review of African Political, we've been very clear on this debate, which is a bit uneasy for academia, and we've had internal debates, because if your interpretation is that, oh, we broke international law, oh, there's an internal contradiction, well, look a bit closer. Think Rwanda and Mahmoud Mamdani's When Victims Becomes Killers. He was part of our collective back in the 70s. Think about the Herero genocide in Namibia. Africa teaches us again to just look closer whether international law really goes against the rule of the most powerful or not. Look closer, and Eurocentrism is part of this type of interpretation. So if you want to check out our issue on imperialism, it's free access, it's open access for all. Thank you.
We got the message. Thanks everyone, especially the